Our next guest is Shaka Senghor. He has an amazing life story that we probably won't get to more than just brush on today. But he's also working on one of the more compelling issues of society today, that being the issue of our over-incarceration, our over-imprisonment, particularly of young black males. Shaka, as I said, it's a fascinating background. Currently, he's a director of strategy for Cut50. He's a professor at the University of Michigan. He's published his memoirs, and I love this name, Righting My Wrongs. It was a great title. And kind of exciting, something I'm not totally aware of, but the TED interviews that are kind of a phenomenon. He has a TED interview that's been viewed by over 1.2 million people. So I think for the homework assignment on today's show, we're going to have everybody watch Shaka's TED interview, and I think that'll kind of tie together what we're talking about today. So in preparing for today's interview, I opened my mail a week or two ago, and there's the Economist. I think I've mentioned before, the Economist is one of the sources I go to for news. And you can see the headline right there, Jailhouse Nation, 2.3 million reasons to fix America's prison problem. Well, obviously, if the Economist thinks it's important enough to put it on the headline of their magazine, it's clearly, one of the top issues of the day. And I had already arranged to talk to Shaka, so imagine how excited I was to find out how relevant this conversation is going to be, and I'm certain how interesting this conversation is going to be. So, Shaka, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you here.
Yeah.
Enjoying Aspen so far?
Yeah, actually, it's a beautiful state and beautiful city, so I'm enjoying it.
And I guess I should have mentioned, not only is the Economist having a headline about this issue, but the Aspen Ideas Fest this year, I think, is full coverage on this issue of incarceration,
Yeah.
prisoners' rights, all these other things. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here today.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I think it's an issue that's really important. It affects everybody in the nation, especially when you think about the number of men and women who are currently incarcerated, 2.3 million. That's just in prison alone. It's not even including jails and other facilities.
Yeah.
So we basically incarcerate a population that's equivalent to some countries throughout the world.
Oh, absolutely. I was talking to another guest on an interview yesterday, and I was talking about a quote that Senator Durbin from Illinois, I once heard him giving a speech.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of the 20th century, we built more schools than any other society had ever built.
Right.
At the end of the 20th century, we built more prisons than
Yeah.
any society has ever built. It's a
Yeah.
sad commentary.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it speaks to the prison boom that occurred in the last 20 years. So, and most of it occurred as a result of the war on drugs debacle, as I call it. I think it's one of the most ridiculous agendas that we've had in our lifetime when you just think about the impact that it's had on so many lives, and not just the men and women who are incarcerated, but their families and communities as well.
In the 90s, I was the parliamentarian for the legislature in Illinois.
Mm.
So I was in control of the process of how bills move in and out. But I always stood next to the speaker every day, and I get familiar with the dialogue and the debate. I can't tell you in the 90s how many bills were sponsored where legislators were trying to out-tough each other
Yeah.
on how much more they could do to be tough on crime, throw them in jail, lock away the key, 3 strikes and you're out. It was almost as if it was a competition.
Yeah, definitely.
It was frightening.
Yeah, and I think when you really reflect back on those times, you'll realize how absurd the idea of being tough on anything is. Especially when you're thinking about our paid officials. The goal should have been from the very beginning to be smart on crime. To be tough on crime just makes absolutely no sense. And to me, it just was more of an ego boost and people trying to fight and ensure that they had maintain their political position, because it speaks to the emotions of people, especially if you're living in cities where, there's high levels of crime. It's easy to arouse those emotions, and instead of thinking from a real logical standpoint, they chose to, approach things very emotionally. And it's just created this unbelievable situation that we're in now where you have just so many people incarcerated.
Yeah, and remember also, political attack pieces. That's what
Right.
politicians live by.
Yeah.
The fear was, I sure hope someone can't send a piece to say I'm soft on crime.
Right.
That was anathema to these politicians.
Yeah.
And then you wake up 20-some years later, and there's 2.3 million people in prison, and as you said, many more than that.
Yeah.
In some form of incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, you have those who are incarcerated, those who have been released from incarceration that's currently on probation or parole, those who can no longer vote, those who have been discriminated against when it comes to housing, employment. So it has had a devastating impact on a nation as a whole. And I think if we don't get a hold of this thing now, it'll only get worse.
Well, it seems as though people such as yourself and a few other people have kind of caught some lightning in a bottle here. It seems like people want to get a hold of it. So tell us about Cut50 and what they're doing.
So Cut50, our organization, it's a national organization. We're headquartered in Oakland. It was founded by Van Jones and Jessica Jackson. And our goal is to smartly reduce the prison population by 50% over the next 10 years. And oftentimes when we mention reducing the prison population by 50%, people kind of balk at the idea, the thought. But if you really go back and you think how vastly it increased over the last 20 years, you'll realize it's not that hard to do if we just really approach it smartly and we think about other diversionary programs that we can use as opposed to our incarceration. So, you know, when you look at prisons now, they have become mental institutions. They have become substance abuse treatment centers. And if you divert those two populations in and of themselves, it'll dramatically reduce the prison population. And unfortunately, we just live in a society where mental illness has been criminalized to the point that we're not treating men and women who suffer from schizophrenia and bipolar disorders as, you know, men and women with mental illnesses. We're treating them as criminals. So if you just think about those different ways, also reducing recidivism by ensuring that if you're going to lock somebody up, to ensure that they have the tools that's necessary to re-socialize and reintegrate into society in a successful and healthy way.
I think I told you when we were getting ready for the interview that my roots are in Chicago, and Sheriff Tom Dart used to be a state legislator who I had a relationship with, and I also coincidentally do work for a lot of inner city hospitals.
Right.
So I kind of revolve around this mental health issue, and it's becoming a staggering issue, not just at the prison level, but at the hospital level, because emergency rooms are filled with people who have mental health issues.
Right.
So Tom Dart, the sheriff, basically says he runs the largest mental health institution in the state of Illinois, if not the country.
Right.
That's what the jails have become. But that's the sad commentary. There's other ways to solve these problems without the incarceration, correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you think about our system as it exists now, it's been a complete failure when it comes to dealing with mental illness. And it's failing at a rate that if it was any other form of employment or any other business, that it would have been shut down. And so surprisingly, the criminal justice system has been able to sustain itself and maintain, largely because of the American public's lack of awareness about what really happens inside prisons, what really happens in the judicial system as a whole, and how people are really treated, because there's not a lot of transparency. And so when you have this covert system that exists, it makes it easy to filter that many people in and out of county jails, in and out of hospitals, without taxpayers even being aware that this is taking place.
No, that's true. So Cut50 is one of many groups in the country working to solve the problem. What are some of your solution sets? I know you want to reduce the number, but how do we reduce that number?
So a couple of things. One of the things I think that we really need to do is roll back some of the bills that were passed during the Clinton administration, the kind of bills that basically help lead to the increase in prison population.
So in this case, you're talking about federal legislation.
Federal legislation, but federal legislation that also impacted states.
Okay. And then state copycat legislation.
Things like, truth and sentencing.
Okay.
Those type of reforms I think are really essential. I also think that reforms in drug sentencing is really essential. Like, we incarcerate far too many people for low-level drug crimes than anybody else in the world. And these are people who oftentimes are suffering from drug addiction and who may hustle on the side to feed that addiction, or who may have just got caught with personal use, and then they end up in prison for very lengthy sentences, and when they could be in treatment, you know, as opposed to being housed in prison.
And some of those are the ones that fell into the 3 strikes and you're out. They had maybe, I don't want to say harmful because they were illegal at the time and they are still illegal now, but they still have minor type penalties, minor type felonies, and certainly not not violent crime by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah, and so so you have a lot of people who were victims of the 3 strikes, the truth and sentencing, the habitual offender, and it has different names in every state. And the reality is, a lot of times these are petty crimes, you know, property crimes that are on the books as felonies, but they're not a serious threat to anybody. It's something that you can treat. If you treat addiction, you can solve that problem. But even I really don't like to venture down the path of making it a either or thing when it comes to violent offenders or non-violent offenders, largely because those who have been convicted of violent crimes are the least likely to go back to prison than any other part of the population. And so I think when we think about the prison system, we have to think about it holistically. I know it doesn't make us comfortable to talk about violent offenders possibly being released from prison or possibly receiving necessary treatment and rehabilitative counseling while they're in prison. But if you've ever been inside prison, you'll realize it makes every bit of sense to ensure that whoever enters that space are being provided with the wraparound services that's necessary to ensure that they successfully transition back to society whenever they're released, whether that's 1 year or 30 years, but to ensure that they are prepared for life after prison.
So in this show, as you know, we talk about why the fact that the political system is dysfunctional and how we're going to solve this. And a lot of times we're looking for solutions where you don't have to go back to the political system because they can't get anything done. But in this case, there is no choice. This problem must be solved through undoing legislation in most cases.
Yeah,
right?
I think the at the the higher end of turning this thing around, there definitely has to be a change in terms of legislation. There has to be some policy, some bills passed, because I think that's crucial in terms of mass and volume. But also on a social level, on the state level, in cities, we just have to do a better job at providing the wraparound services that's necessary for men and women who are actually returning from incarceration, but also creating alternatives to incarceration and putting money back into those spaces. You know, if you think about reducing the prison population, which means closing down prisons, you can actually open up health institutions that provide treatment for those who are suffering from mental illness, those who are suffering from substance abuse, and then also coming up with alternatives to incarceration for those who may not have serious crimes.
Now, one thing I think is good, and I got this from The Economist, the prison population actually has leveled off now. We're not growing at this point, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Well, you know, I'm always skeptical of those numbers because I was actually incarcerated, and I know how the system works in terms of misleading people to think that the numbers have fell off because they may say instead of they just may label different a person who's actually incarcerated. They may label it different. They may say that he's in a reception center as opposed to in prison.
Gotcha.
But in reality, that person is still in prison for petty violations or minor violations of parole, things like that. So, you know, I'm not as excited about the numbers leveling it off because at the end of the day, it's still 2.3 million people
still
incarcerated.
Too many, no matter
right.
what.
Yeah, definitely.
So it seems to me you have to have a legislative agenda, but someone is doing a terrific job at this point of marrying the left and the right, the liberal and the conservative, because it seems as though both sides now are working together. So are you part of that conversation?
Well, actually, we are at the epicenter of that conversation.
Okay.
On March the 26th, we hosted the first bipartisan criminal justice reform summit in D.C. Okay. We hosted this along with Newt Gingrich.
Cut50 was part of that?
Yeah, Cut50 actually organized it.
Okay.
So we organized it alongside of Newt Gingrich with support of Koch brothers and ACLU and a few other people who really understand that this is not a this is actually a bipartisan issue. Like, this affects people no matter what side of the party line you're on. Your constituents are being affected and impacted by mass incarceration as we see it today.
And that's an amazing victory. Again, the system's dysfunctional, but your issue is on the front of The Economist. It's everywhere now. You're bringing the right and the left together. You got Newt Gingrich at the table. How did this happen? Is it just... It's not magic. Someone made this happen.
No, it's definitely not magic. But I think that one of the things that's magical about it is that both parties have concluded that we have reached a point where the number of people that are incarcerated and the impact it's having on communities is just absurd. And when you really just think of it from a human standpoint, and you think of it from a national standpoint in terms of like national security, when your infrastructure is weak, you're vulnerable as a country. And when you have so many people who are incarcerated in communities that are being devastated by the missing men and women in their communities, that's devastating, and it destabilizes the country. And so I think that anybody that cares about the future of this nation can look beyond party politics and really understand that this is a real human issue.
Now, do you have some champions in the Congress right now that are taking the lead on this?
We definitely have champions, and I would like to think that the majority of the men and women who are like running for office now are taking up some form of some part of this argument. So Cory Booker has been Senator Booker has been really a strong advocate, and a few others. And, you know, I work more on the personal narrative side, the cultural side, the digital side of Cut50. But from the work that we've done, we have bipartisan support across the board.
Is there a piece of legislation working its way through Congress right now, or a couple different pieces?
There's actually a bill working its way through now, and I'm not sure where that bill stands at right now. But I know there's a couple of bills being introduced really soon.
Okay, and then will Cut50 also work at the state level?
Yes, so we work nationally as well as state. We do, so what we're doing now is really looking at states where there are policies that make sense and we're trying to support them, but we're also really working with organizations who work in reentry, who work in alternatives to incarceration. So we work in multiple levels. So as much as we do on the policy end, we also do on the everyday human social side as well.
And let's talk about that a little. I know I want to talk politics here, but you said the human side of this is probably the most important side of all, and that's where you're spending a lot of your time, right?
Yeah.
So tell me about your efforts in that regard.
Well, my efforts in that regard is to put a human face to what incarceration looks like. And for the last, 10 years or so, we've talked about all the statistics and the data. And when you're talking to people who are voting on bills to get passed, while the data sounds great and amusing, most people don't really fully comprehend what those numbers mean. So when you begin to put a human face to those numbers, it makes a deeper connection because people can now see their cousin, their uncle, their aunt, their sister, their mother, and it makes sense that, well, wow, maybe my neighbor has a felony and maybe this is why they can't get a job. It's the natural instinct of us to really be forgiving and to really think about how can we best support those who want to do it right.
Now, I don't know who the opponents would be or their messages, but I'm thinking out loud with you here that you might have opponents who say we're going too fast, that if we put too many people out on the street and they can't adjust properly, we might exacerbate the problem. Do you hear that discussion? I
mean, there's always going to be pushback in regards to reducing the prison population. But in the past, when it has happened, whether it was with drug legislation changing, there hasn't been this upsurge of crime. And so a lot of the fear-based aspects of the war on drugs campaign is no longer relevant because it's been proven that when you give people an opportunity to re-enter society as an asset, most people will take that opportunity. And there's no guarantee that every man or woman who walks out of prison is going to walk a straight and narrow path. But for the most part, when you give people an opportunity to do it the right way, they will.
How do you keep the politicians from wanting to attack each other through Willie Horton type ads and things like that? So, I mean, in that part of the fear here, I'll be part of a bill, someone will get out of prison, they'll commit a violent crime, and next thing you know, it's an attack ad. Is there a way that the Republicans and Democrats can shake hands or something and say, guys, this is such an important issue, let's lay off?
Right. Well, I think the lesson has been learned from that. And I think now, when you think of some of the men and women who are doing amazing work throughout the nation, who were formerly incarcerated, I think their narratives, for every Willie Horton, you got, hundreds of men and women who have re-entered society, who are tax-paying citizens, who are, social work providers, and so the reality is that those scare tactics are no longer relevant, and especially when we live in a digital age where the people have more control of the media than having to rely solely on 3 networks to tell us what's happening in the world. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have all these different media outlets that gives us a broader picture of what it looks like for men and women returning home. And while it's not easy to reintegrate into society, there are hundreds, if not thousands of men and women who have done it successfully, some at a super high level.
Yeah.
And so when we lift up those stories, it kind of, neutralizes the fear-based stories.
Absolutely. So you're on the social, the human interest side of this, and you've created something called the Atonement Project. Tell us a little bit about that.
So 2 years ago, I got a fellowship at MIT Media Lab in Cambridge. And one of the things about the fellowship was I had an opportunity to work in any space within a lab with anybody who was willing to collaborate with me. And so I joined forces with some people at MIT Media Lab Civic, the Civic Media Lab specifically, and we started this project called the Atonement Project. And the idea was to use a cross-section of arts to facilitate a restorative justice conversation between victims of violent crime and violent offenders.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we launched the website for that earlier this year during during one of our annual art exhibits at the University of Michigan. So my fellowship is partnered with my work at the University of Michigan, and that's where we created the Atonement Project. And so we get art that comes out of the prisons. Men and women can submit visual art or any type of writing, you know, creative writing, poetry, short stories, etc., expressing their willingness to apologize and atone for the crime. And the victims of violent crime can interact with these art pieces online in an online format.
It's very interesting. I know a friend of mine's wife was a specialist in art as a teaching tool for special needs, special ed kids.
Yeah.
I assume this is kind of an adjunct field of the same thing, using art for healing and teaching and learning?
Yeah, I think creativity is one of the best ways to help men and women make a successful transition back to society, but also to help them transform their lives. I myself, I started off writing, and that was the tool that I used to turn my life around. And so I have a great value for the creative arts, and especially in spaces like prison and mental, health institutes.
I don't know why this thought came into my head. Does any of this art have value? Is there people selling this art and raising money for?
So not for this specific class, but we do as part of the larger organization that I'm a part of, Prison Creative Arts Project. We do an annual art exhibit every year. It's the largest art exhibit in the world of art that comes out of prison. And there's some beautiful, beautiful art, and collectors from all over the world come to this annual exhibit and buys this art.
Where's it held at?
At the University of Michigan.
Oh, that would be fascinating. What time of the year is it?
In the spring.
Oh, how fascinating. I'd like to go to that. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I told my viewers in the beginning you have 1.2 million views on a TED video. Tell us about your TED video.
So in 2014, I was invited to do a talk at TED's 30th anniversary. And because I have a felony, I wasn't allowed to travel to Vancouver, which is where the conference is held. So they flew me to the TED offices, where I did a talk called Why Your Worst Deeds Shouldn't Define You. And the talk is based on my personal life of growing up. I grew up in the streets of Detroit. I got shot at the age of 17 multiple times. 14 months later, I got into a similar conflict, and I shot and tragically caused a man's death. I was subsequently sentenced to 17 and 40 years in prison, and ultimately served 19, 7 of which was in solitary confinement. And it was in solitary confinement that I began to really go back and analyze how did I end up going from wanting to be a doctor and an honor roll and scholarship student to serving out my most promising years in prison. And so that was the story I was able to tell at TED's 30th anniversary. And so that talk, you can go to TED, and find that talk.
Yeah, how would we find it?
Yeah, just go to TED.com and look up Shaka Senghor.
Shaka Senghor.
Yeah.
Spell Senghor for my viewers. So they
Senghor.
Okay, Shaka Senghor. Okay, perfect. Yeah. And I always want to educate my viewers on all the things we talked about today. So if they want to know about Cut50 and get involved in that, how do we find Cut50?
Go to cut50.org.
Okay,
and
pretty simple.
If you want to learn more about righting my wrongs, my memoir, you can go to shakasenghor.com.
And the Atonement Project?
And the Atonement Project is at theatonementproject.org.
Awesome. Well, Shaka, you got a great message, you got a great story, and I think you guys are really on the cusp of getting a great solution set here, and it's due to not just dedication and hard work, but as you said, educating people, telling the story, and messaging, and then bringing people together. So that's how you get solutions.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.